Before we begin, welcome to Amerixa Daily, the channel where we uncover the hidden systems shaping world events, power, money, and geopolitics. If you enjoy deep dive stories that completely change how you see the world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Donald Trump believed this war would be quick. A burst of overwhelming force. A few devastating operations. A final negotiation. Then victory. That was the promise. But now, weeks have turned into months. Oil prices are shaking the global economy. American approval ratings are collapsing. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on Earth, has become a pressure point for the entire planet. And somehow, the strongest military power in history looks trapped. Beat. So here's the paradox. How can a superpower dominate the battlefield, and still be unable to end the war? Think about that for a moment. America can deploy aircraft carriers across oceans. It can strike targets thousands of miles away. It spends more on defense than the next several nations combined. And yet Iran, economically weaker, technologically behind, internationally isolated, continues to resist. Not only resist, but slowly reshape the conditions of the conflict itself. Gas prices rise. Shipping routes freeze. Political pressure builds. Allies grow nervous. Financial markets wobble. And suddenly, the question changes. The issue is no longer, can America destroy targets? The issue becomes, can America afford what happens next? Let's start with the obvious assumption. Most people imagine wars like movies. The stronger side attacks. The weaker side collapses. The conflict ends. Simple. That's how conventional power is supposed to work. If one side has bigger weapons, more money, more technology, more satellites, more aircraft carriers, then victory should just be a matter of time. Right? But here's where it gets fascinating. Modern wars don't always operate on the logic of destruction. Sometimes they operate on the logic of endurance. And those are completely different games. Because in an endurance war, the weaker side doesn't need to win outright. It just needs to survive long enough to make victory unbearable for the stronger side. That's the trap. And Trump may have walked directly into it. Now at first glance, the American strategy seemed overwhelming. Target military infrastructure. Pressure Iran economically. Demonstrate absolute dominance. Force negotiations quickly. That was the theory. And on paper, it looked unstoppable. Iran's air defenses suffered heavy damage. Military commanders were eliminated. Critical infrastructure was hit. Naval movements were disrupted. From Washington, it looked like pressure was building toward an inevitable collapse. But something strange happened. Iran didn't fold. Instead, it adapted. And that adaptation revealed something incredibly important about the modern world. Because Iran possesses one thing far more powerful than most people realize. Leverage. Not military superiority. Leverage. Here's where the entire story changes. The Strait of Hormuz. A narrow stretch of water most people have never thought about, controls an enormous percentage of the world's oil flow. Think about that for a second. A tiny geographic choke point influences the energy supply of entire continents. And Iran sits directly beside it. So while America controls unmatched military force, Iran controls uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to the global economy. Oil traders panic. Shipping insurers panic. Governments panic. Markets panic. Suddenly, every missile strike creates financial consequences far beyond the battlefield. And those consequences begin spreading into ordinary American life. Gas stations. Grocery stores. Electric bills. Transportation costs. Everything becomes more expensive. Beat. Now here's the twist. Wars are not fought only overseas anymore. They are fought inside public opinion. And that may be where Trump's real problem begins. Because politically, time is deadly. Every additional week of conflict increases pressure at home. Approval ratings drop. Headlines grow darker. Economic anxiety spreads. And eventually the public starts asking the most dangerous question any leader can face. What exactly are we accomplishing? That question is political dynamite. Especially when there's no clear ending. Beat. Now let's talk about the silver bullet problem. Because this is where Trump's strategy becomes especially fascinating. Again and again, the administration appeared to search for one decisive move that would finally break Iran's resistance. One operation. One shock. One psychological turning point. First came bombing campaigns. Then targeted strikes. Then naval pressure. Then emergency maritime operations. Then sudden peace announcements. Then abrupt reversals. Each new strategy was presented almost like a final chapter. And each time, the conflict continued. Why? Because modern asymmetric warfare doesn't behave like traditional war. Think about boxing for a moment. In normal boxing, the stronger fighter wins by overpowering the opponent. But asymmetric warfare is more like fighting smoke. Every direct strike changes the shape of the conflict instead of ending it. The battlefield keeps moving. Beat. Here's the deeper problem. America's military is designed to destroy military targets. But many modern conflicts are political systems disguised as wars. And political systems don't collapse just because infrastructure collapses. In fact, external pressure can sometimes strengthen them. Iran's leadership understands this perfectly. For them, survival itself becomes victory. Not dominance. Not conquest. Survival. If the regime remains standing. If the state remains functional. If resistance continues. Then they can claim they outlasted the most powerful country on earth. And psychologically, that matters enormously. Beat. Now let's layer this even further. Because this conflict isn't only military. It's economic. Political. Psychological. Global. And all those layers interact with each other constantly. Think about how strange this really is. The United States can destroy billions of dollars worth of infrastructure in days. But a disruption in shipping lanes can trigger economic damage across entire continents almost instantly. That's the modern paradox of power. The stronger the global economy becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes to disruption. And Iran understands this. That's why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. Not because Iran can defeat America militarily, but because it can create enough instability to force negotiation. That's leverage. Beat. Now let's bring this down to one ordinary person. Imagine a truck driver in Ohio. He wakes up at 5 a.m., starts his route. Fills his tank. But now fuel prices have surged again. Suddenly his weekly costs explode. The grocery chains raise prices because shipping costs rise. Consumers buy less. Hours get cut. Stress builds. He's not thinking about geopolitics. He's thinking about survival. And this is where foreign wars become domestic realities. A conflict thousands of miles away starts reshaping daily American life. That truck driver may support strength. He may support military action. But if his rent rises, if groceries rise, if wages stagnate, eventually his patience changes. That's how long wars erode political support. Not through ideology. Through exhaustion. Beat. And here's where it gets even more complicated for Trump. Because Trump built much of his political identity around one central promise. Strength. Decisive action. Fast results. Winning. But endurance wars punish leaders who promise speed. Because every extra week becomes evidence that reality is more complicated than the original promise. That creates a dangerous cycle. The leader becomes incentivized to announce progress constantly, even when the situation remains unresolved. That's why you begin hearing repeated declarations that deals are very close. That's why operations suddenly change names. Strategies shift rapidly. Optimism appears almost disconnected from reality. Because politically, confidence becomes part of the battlefield itself. Beat. Now think about the psychological contradiction here. The United States appears overwhelmingly powerful. Yet that very power creates expectations of quick victory. And when quick victory doesn't happen, the perception of strength begins weakening. Meanwhile, Iran has the opposite dynamic. Nobody expects Iran to dominate militarily. So simply continuing the fight becomes a symbolic success. Do you see the asymmetry? America is punished for delay. Iran is rewarded for endurance. That changes everything. Beat. And here's the final layer most people never consider. Wars today are no longer isolated events. They are media systems, financial systems, narrative systems, energy systems. Every missile strike creates headlines. Every headline moves markets. Every market movement affects elections. Every election affects military decisions. Everything is connected. Which means modern power is no longer just about force, it's about managing interconnected pressure. And that's much harder. Beat. Now let's step back for a moment. Because this story isn't really just about Trump. Or Iran. Or even this particular war. It's about a transformation in how global power works. For most of history, empires controlled territory through overwhelming force. But in an interconnected world, weaker actors discovered something revolutionary. You don't always need to defeat a superpower. You only need to raise the cost of victory high enough that continuing becomes politically, economically, and psychologically unbearable. That's the hidden equation. And once you understand it, modern geopolitics suddenly starts making a lot more sense. Why insurgencies survive. Why massive militaries struggle. Why smaller nations still hold leverage. Why conflicts drag on endlessly despite overwhelming firepower. Because the objective is no longer always military victory. Sometimes the objective is simply to make the stronger side bleed time, money, stability, and political will. Beat. And maybe that's the real reason this war feels so confusing. Because we still imagine power the old way. Bigger army. Bigger weapons. Bigger explosions. But modern power may actually depend more on resilience than dominance. More on endurance than conquest. More on leverage than destruction. And that realization changes how you see everything. Beat. Because the strongest nation in the world can still become trapped. If the system around it becomes too interconnected to control. And once you see that, once you realize modern wars are fought through economics, psychology, energy, politics, and public exhaustion all at once. You stop seeing global conflicts as simple battles. You start seeing them as pressure systems. Complex. Interconnected. Fragile. And suddenly, the question is no longer who has the strongest military. The real question becomes who can survive the consequences longest. Beat. And that may be the most dangerous shift in global power the modern world has ever seen. And that may be the most dangerous shift in global power the modern world has ever seen. If this video changed the way you think about power, war, and global politics, then don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Amerixa Daily for more deep, cinematic breakdowns of the stories shaping our world. Comment below, do you think modern wars are now won by endurance instead of military strength? And as always, thank you for watching Amerixa Daily.